So it's your turn to get up and speak. And you figuratively get up on your soapbox, and what happens next? As you may have already recognized, starting a speech can be fairly difficult, and ending one can be just as hard. This recorded lecture talks about introductions, conclusions, and transitions, three of the key elements in making for an effective speech. As we've probably talked about before, preparing a speech is a lot like making a sandwich. When you make a sandwich, you first figure out what type of sandwich you want. Then you can get into the business of making the sandwich with a slice of bread, the main part, which is your meat, cheese, and veggies, the sauces, and finally, another piece of bread. If we understand how to make a sandwich, we can understand how to write a speech. Just like needing to know the type of sandwich, you always start your speech with your big ideas, particularly the specific purpose and the thesis statement. First slice of bread is like an introduction. The body of the speech is all of the stuff in the middle. The other piece of, the sauces that you need is like the transition. And finally, the other piece of bread is the conclusion. Understanding where introductions, transitions, and conclusions fit into this metaphor help the rest of the speech making all that more important. Bread provides structural integrity to a sandwich. It's what holds the whole thing together. If you have a sandwich without bread, you really don't have a sandwich. Likewise, introductions and conclusions provide the structural integrity to a speech. You need a good introduction and you need a good conclusion to hold the whole thing together. Getting into the speech and getting out of the speech are some of the most difficult parts. Well-planned introductions and conclusions allow you to get in and out of a speech with grace. And as we talk about introductions and conclusions, remember that if you have them well planned and if you execute them the way that you've planned, they can do the job by themselves. Don't introduce your introduction or conclude your conclusion. Let the parts do their job. Allow me to illustrate this final point. Imagine the speaker that stands up in front of the class and says, "I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to start my speech by asking you a question." Then they ask the question. Notice that they've lied to you and lied to you twice. They didn't start their speech by asking a question. They started their speech by telling you they were going to ask a question. And they didn't start their speech by telling you they were going to ask a question. They started the speech by telling you how happy they were to be there. All of that extraneous stuff we don't need. If your attention getter is a question, just get up and ask the question. Let the parts do their job. Likewise, at the end of the speech, we don't need "and that's all I got" to let us know that your speech is finished. Have a strong conclusion and let the speech end with that. It's important to include in your speech organization and repetition in ways that you might not need that in written communication. Because it's live, because there's no way to rewind, because there's no way to go back to the beginning, because there's no way to see the visual cues of headings and paragraph spacing and white space on a page, the speech needs to make your organization obvious, and you need to use repetition so that people will remember the key parts of the speech. So how do we do this? Well, one of the best pieces of advice that I've heard and can pass on is this. Tell them what you are going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Excellent advice for any public speaking situation. Let your audience know what they're going to get, then give it to them, and then remind them what you gave them. And yes, this might sound forced, and yes, this might sound repetition, and yes, you might feel like you're playing Captain Obvious, But remember, the obvious organization and repetition is important in speeches that may not be important in writing. So let's get around to the specifics of introductions. Again, I teach introductions slightly different than your textbook. According to me, an introduction has three main parts. The first is an attention getter. Your textbook calls this gaining and maintaining favorable attention. Same, different. All of the suggestions that the textbook gives you in that section, I can heartily recommend. So you do something to get the audience's attention. You then need to state the thesis. I am a big fan of stating the thesis, and unless there is a compelling reason to use a delayed thesis structure, the thesis should be clearly stated in the introduction. Particularly for an informative speech, there is no excuse for the thesis statement to not be clearly stated in the introduction. Statement of thesis needs to be followed by a preview, and I typically just use the word preview, but what I'm really talking about is a preview of main points. Tell us what we can expect. If you've got 3 reasons, don't say, here are 3 reasons. Tell us what those 3 reasons are so that we can look forward to listening to those later on in the rest of the speech. A good introduction should take in total about 10 to 15% of the total speaking time. And I would also feel comfortable with that 10 to 15% of total words or pages if you are writing something as well. For a 6 to 8 minute speech, 10 to 15% of your total speaking time is somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 30 seconds to a minute. That's not a lot of time, but it does give you enough time to do the 3 key things that introductions need to do, which again, according to me, the attention getter, the statement of thesis, and the preview. Your textbook also includes the idea that you can relate the topic to the presenter and you can relate the topic to the audience. I have no problem with you doing that, and if you're going to do that, an introduction's as good a place as any to do that, but I will not be specifically requiring it or looking for it. The other place where I differ from the textbook is they tend to put both the thesis and the preview and mush that together into what they call the forecasting statement. I think it works better when they are 2 separate sentences. Public speaking is going to use shorter sentences than writing, so make that the work of 2 different sentences and clearly state your thesis and clearly preview what's going to happen. The other end of this, of course, is the conclusion. According to me, a conclusion consists of 2 points, a review, and really what I mean is a review of main points. This is the part where you tell us what you told us. It is the preview in past tense. And I remember one of my English professors, actually, who said that the best way to write an introduction is to write the whole paper, write the conclusion, then copy and paste the conclusion at the beginning after throwing away the original introduction, and then write a different conclusion. This idea of everything at the end, putting at the beginning, that's really important. So again, you're going to review the main points. You're going to remind us of everything that you've already said in a quick review. It's what your textbook calls the instant replay function. Again, I like the idea of a review and clearly restating your main points. The review will be followed by the final thought. What's the last thing that you want ringing in the ears of the audience when you are all done? And the advice in the textbook is pretty good. Maybe the final thought is an action ending. Maybe the final thought is an important story. Maybe it's a great quotation. A lot of the things that make for good introductions also make for the attention getters in introductions make for really good final thoughts in conclusion. And again, end big, and when you've ended, your speech is done, and don't worry about concluding your conclusion. Conclusions are also important, but they don't have as many parts and they don't have to do as much work as an introduction. So a good conclusion is going to come in somewhere around 5 to 10% of your total speaking time. So again, for a conclusion for the speeches that you'll be giving in this class, 20 to 40 seconds is probably about right for a conclusion. A few other thoughts on conclusions. Some of you may have been taught that restating your thesis statement in the conclusion is a good idea. And it probably is. I have nothing bad to say against that advice, but once again, that's, for me, one of those things that's going to be optional. I'm not really looking for it, but if you do it, that's great. More power to you. The other thing that your textbook talks about is the idea that a conclusion has what they call the brake light function. Let your audience know that you're coming to the end. Again, for me, that becomes optional. The transition into the conclusion will probably do that, so you don't need to do it twice. And if you let the transition into the conclusion do that, then that works well. And again, is that the last thing before the conclusion, or is that the first thing in the conclusion? Either way, you're okay. Also, in many ways, a good review doubles as that brake light function, letting us know that we are coming to the end. The other thing to talk about in this presentation is the idea of transitions. Back in the sandwich analogy, the transitions are like the sauces or the condiments, the mayonnaise, the mustard. Again, notice that smooths everything out so it's easier to at least eat, perhaps to digest. Also connects a lot of the tastes with each other, which is one of the other great things that condiments do in a sandwich. But the main purpose of a transition is to smoothly connect the ideas of your speech to each other. Recognize that you've got some distinct portions of the speech. You have an introduction, you have a conclusion, you have main points. And what is it that makes all of those things come together in smooth ways so we avoid what I call this mental whiplash, the idea of going too rapidly from one idea to another. Transitions allow you to do that. I don't have much more to say on transitions other than the textbook. I like the idea that transitions can also be used as signposts to let us know where you are in your speech. So if you just finished your first main point and you're moving to your second main point, doesn't hurt anything at all to say, as I finished my first main point and going to my second main point. And again, we should know that those were the first and second points, because that's what the introductions, particularly the preview part of the introduction, set us up for. This is also a good time to do internal previews and internal reviews. In the same way that we have a big one at the beginning and a big one at the end, is this a way to say, okay, I've kind of reviewed my first point and I'm leading into my second point, and let these transitions do their job for you. When you submit the full sentence outline, make sure that all of these elements, the introduction and its parts, the conclusions and its parts, and the transitions, are clearly labeled. I don't have a real preference on the formatting that you use to label them. As long as it's clearly labeled, I should be able to immediately look at the speech outline and say, oh, here are the parts of the introduction. Make them a part of your outline. Of course, that only works if you also incorporate them into the speech. Remember that these are key things that you need to do, not just for the sake of the outline, but for the sake of the listener. And this final idea on the screen is make them sound like what they are. And that's a really awkward way of saying your preview needs to sound like a preview. Your review needs to sound like a review. On more than one occasion, I have listened to a speech and never really caught a preview. Then I saw it later in the outline, and I remember the speaker saying those words, but it didn't sound like an outline, or excuse me, it didn't sound like a preview when they did it. So again, how do we use pauses? How do we perhaps play Captain Obvious? Today I will talk about, my speech will discuss these sorts of things, so that previews and reviews are clearly labeled. As a final thought to this presentation, introductions and conclusion allow you to get in and out of your speech with grace and hold the whole thing together. These are important elements that need to be planned, need to be incorporated, need to be skillfully executed, and when you use them properly, you will see great benefits in the overall success of your speech.